I'm joined today by Philip Gibbons, who is the director of the documentary film The Devil and the Death Penalty. It revisits the case of Lawrence Bittaker, a convicted serial murderer and child killer who's been on death row at San Quentin in California since 1981. Philip, tell us, how did you first get into doing a film about this?
I lived in Hermosa and Redondo Beach, and a lot of the residents, longtime residents there, told me the story of Lawrence Bittaker. And in such a beautiful Pacific Coast setting, it was hard for me to believe that something that horrible could happen. And most of these conversations would conclude with me asking, okay, well, Lawrence Bittaker was sentenced to death. Obviously, he was executed or died in prison, and because this happened in 1979. And the answer I would get would be, no, he's very much alive on death row at San Quentin. And when I would ask, well, what's going on with his appeals, people would just shrug their shoulders. And as far back as the late 90s, I started to investigate exactly what was going on with Lawrence Bittaker, hence the film.
And what was the reasoning for why, in spite being on death row since 1981, he has not been executed? Is it because of appeals, or is there some other explanation?
Well, that's how you wind up with a 75-minute documentary, but I think it's important for your viewers to understand that all executions in the state of California have been on hold since 2006. Lawrence Bittaker's case, like many cases in California, just because there are many people, when I say many, there's at least 100 or 200 people who have been on death row since the 80s. And only 13 people since 1979 have been executed. There are now 750 people on California's death row, again, dating back as far as 1980. And that has to do with the stalemate between the appellate courts, both federal and state, and the voters who basically took this out of the hands of the state courts, and by referendum have made it impossible for the states to get rid of capital punishment unless another popular referendum is passed doing that. The last attempt to try to get rid of capital punishment by popular referendum failed in 2012.
Two questions regarding the cost of all this. First of all, if we didn't have this sort of moratorium that's going on right now, what is the cost comparison between someone in prison without parole for life versus a death penalty execution, or does it depend actually on how long it takes to make that execution happen?
It kind of depends on who you speak with. During the referendum election, the legislative analysts came up with a number of $130 million annually spent. I mean, that would pencil out to a per prisoner type of cost, but I would say that just for the sake of argument, that's a number that I think people should try to wrap their arms around, but also to put that number in perspective, because abolitionists have obviously used cost as an argument to get rid of capital punishment. But for instance, the annual budget of the Los Angeles Police Department is $1.4 billion. The annual budget of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department is $1.2 billion. So putting that, giving you an order of magnitude, yes, it is hundreds of millions of dollars on an annual basis, but the mere cost in a state that has a $109 billion annual budget would seem pretty insignificant when you're discussing what a lot of these people have done, which is something we may get into later on.
Yeah, so as you did research and talk to people around this story, talk to us a little bit about what you uncovered with regard to what would be achieved via the execution of Lawrence Bittaker. In other words, were there specific individuals who felt that his execution would in any way be justice rather than revenge?
Again, it basically depends on your perspective. And as I'm sure you're aware, capital punishment really engenders a lot of very emotional responses. I think my personal opinion is, while I'm very ambivalent about capital punishment, especially as practiced in places like Texas and Florida and Georgia, California is very different in that it's a very rare individual. Only 2% of individuals charged with homicide basically ever are subjected to even a capital punishment trial. So the people who wind up on death row, like Lawrence Bittaker, have done particularly heinous things. And so the issue becomes, for me personally, what is the standard? I mean, what is the line that you're going to cross? And in his case, when he basically kidnapped with a co-conspirator, kidnapped, tortured, and raped 5 teenage girls in a fashion that the prosecutor who prosecuted both men described as worse than Manson. You're talking about a level of depravity here that is quite unusual and quite dissimilar, shall we say, to say the state of Texas. What would it accomplish? I mean, in a philosophical sense, you could have that argument. I think you could have a whole semester of a class at Cal Berkeley to discuss that question. I can't. To me personally, I find it to be so heinous that that basically, that it almost, it's common sense that an individual like him, who by the way is a totally unrepentant psychopath, would basically, that the only really, I think, common sense thing to do, that the only thing that would make sense in terms of punishment for this guy, who's made it clear that he couldn't care less about what he did and about other people, is execution, because that's basically the only thing that will ever get this person's attention.
Yeah, I don't think I agree with you in a couple of senses. Number one, having to spend, you execute this guy, the lights go off and that's it. Whatever punishment, whatever he has to deal with by sitting in that cell for the rest of his life and rotting is eliminated. He is relieved of that, as opposed to saying, psychopath or not, he's going to sit there and he's going to do nothing for the rest of his life. But putting that aside for a second, Philip, when we think about this, when you made this argument of this was a particularly heinous crime, this is a serial murderer and child killer, and one of the most interesting arguments I've heard against what California does, which is reserving it only for the most extreme cases, is that it is devaluing to the victims of a lone murderer. In other words, if you have a murderer who killed one person and California says, that's not heinous enough for us to put that person to death, isn't it in a sense devaluing or an insult to the to the families of the victims of someone who only killed one person? You're saying if only one person died, that's not really as bad as if they killed multiple people.
Well, I think that, again, we live in California, and surprisingly, by the way, on an annual basis, when you compare it to Texas, for instance, Texas in 2012, had 10 death sentences handed out by juries. In California, there were 24. So I think, though, to address your specific question, if you got into in a state like California with 35 million people, if you started to basically have juries that were convicting people of lone murders and sentencing to death, the number of people who would go to death row in California would be staggering. I mean,
but hold on a second, Philip, because now you're making a logistical argument. You're saying now first let me see if I can wrap my head around this.
Sure.
First, you said that in really heinous cases like this one, you think the death penalty is the only logical solution, the only logical punishment. But when I said, doesn't that in some way tell the victims, the families of the victims who were just killed individually, that their victim, their family member, was not worth enough for the perpetrator to get the death penalty? You say, well, now logistically it would be complex. Those are two different arguments.
Well, they are, and yet I would say, again, there's the sort of the philosophical discussion we're having, not as if we're on two. I'm not sure that we're on two different sides of the spectrum. In fact, someone who would in California adhere to the idea that even people who murder one person should also be punishable based on the interest of the victims' families. I understand that viewpoint. I guess what I'm getting to is, having studied this, the reality of that ever happening is just non-existent. It's just that the mindset of juries in this state is such that again, the people who wind up getting these types of sentences are people who are, again, so beyond the pale that it's almost
but again, the practicality of it, I don't think, is a factor when we're talking about what is right or wrong. For me, Philip, the issues are, number one, I don't believe in the state putting people to death. In other words, I believe that it is wrong for the state or federal government to decide this crime now is going to allow us to legally kill this person. I'm against that. Number two, when I look at what other countries still have the death penalty and what other countries have chosen to get rid of it, and I look at what else those same countries have done right and wrong, the U.S. is really an outlier in terms of the developed, wealthy nations and maintaining this. And to me, that's a real concern. And then number three, we've seen no evidence whatsoever. I mean, literally no evidence that the death penalty works as a deterrent to people committing crimes. So I've decided, for me personally, that this is an outdated, retrograde practice that serves no judicial purpose and is more an issue of revenge rather than justice. That's me, you know?
I totally understand, and that's a very eloquently stated perspective, and frankly, it's a perspective that it's all of those things resonate with me. And yet, after making a film of this kind, you become so frustrated because, again, when you read about people like Lawrence Bittaker and you understand their personalities, it may not make any real, everything you say may potentially be, or even may be actually true in a sense of real practicality in terms of what we should do and how we should proceed. And yet there's something about him as an individual and others like him that strikes such an emotional chord that I think you can understand the other viewpoint, that there are people who don't feel the way that
Of
you
course,
feel.
and what you're saying, actually, I've admitted that I can imagine specific situations where someone I know is killed, where I might have an emotional reaction, as you indicated, that makes me want that person dead. But I feel, in the same way that you just said, confirming my suspicions, that those would be emotional reactions that make me want revenge rather than an application of justice by the judicial system.
Well, the other aspect too, though, David, that my film gets into is putting aside again the two sort of philosophical viewpoints we've discussed. The other aspect of this is, how is media dealing with this issue in the state, and also how is the judiciary and the apparatus that is in charge of this? Because California has this situation where, quite frankly, both the judiciary and the bureaucracy are acting in a fashion that is, despite anyone's philosophical viewpoint, the rule of law in the state, as ratified 4 times by popular referendum, has called for this to be the punishment. And whether you agree with that, behind the scenes, a small group of elite people have done everything possible to frustrate that.
Yeah, but Philip, that argument doesn't resonate with me, because the anti-gay bigots make the same argument when it comes to voting against same-sex marriage. And we can still say that you can't vote, a popular vote can't determine everything, and there are certain cases where we could just determine things are either immoral, unethical, against the law, unconstitutional, etc. So while I'm not making those specific arguments here, the fact that a referendum happened should not ultimately decide what it is that takes place with every single issue. But that's probably an argument for a different day, because unfortunately we are out of time. I do want to recommend to people the film, The Devil and the Death Penalty. Whatever your position about the death penalty, Philip Gibbons' film will be of interest to you. And I can't thank you enough for being here today.
It's my pleasure, and I would just like to interject that it is available currently on iTunes and Xbox 360 and through my website, thedevilandthedeathpenalty.com.